The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base in Coronado, California. Inside the briefing room, 12 of the most elite warriors in the world sat in perfect rows, their faces hard as stone. These were Navy SEALs, men who had survived the most brutal training on Earth, who had faced death in the darkest corners of the world, and who feared nothing. At the front of the room stood Commander Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. His chest bore ribbons that told stories of heroism most people could only imagine. Scars on his hands and face whispered of battles fought in places that didn't exist on any map. When he spoke, even the toughest men listened. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Today we're discussing our new addition to the team." A collective stiffening ran through the room. Every man knew what this meant. For months, rumors had been swirling about the first woman to complete SEAL training. The possibility had been discussed in hushed tones, met with skepticism, anger, and in some cases outright hostility. The door at the back of the room opened with a soft click. All heads turned as Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked in. She was smaller than any of them, standing barely 5 feet 6 inches tall. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but there was something in her eyes that made several of the men shift uncomfortably. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was the same cold fire they recognized in their own mirrors. Chen had grown up in a small town in Oregon, the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for the American dream. Her father worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and her mother cleaned offices at night after working in a factory all day. From childhood, Sarah had learned that nothing came easy, that every victory had to be earned with blood, sweat, and tears. When she announced her intention to join the Navy, her parents were terrified. When she said she wanted to be a SEAL, they thought she had lost her mind. "Women don't do that," her father had said, not from malice but from genuine concern. "It's too dangerous, too hard." But Sarah had already made up her mind. She had spent her teenage years training like a machine, running before dawn, swimming in freezing lakes, pushing her body beyond what anyone thought possible. The SEAL training had been a nightmare that lasted 6 months. Hell Week alone had broken men twice her size. The instructors had pushed her harder than anyone else, looking for any sign of weakness, any excuse to send her home. They made her carry heavier packs, swim longer distances, and endure longer periods of sleep deprivation. Every day they expected her to quit. Every day she refused. Now, as she stood before this room full of America's deadliest warriors, Sarah felt the weight of their judgment like a physical force. She could see it in their eyes. Doubt, resentment, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed anger. To them, she represented change, and change was something they had never learned to trust. Commander Morrison cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Chen has completed all required training and has been assigned to Alpha Team for immediate deployment." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension throughout the room. "I expect her to be treated with the same respect you show each other." Petty Officer First Class Mike Rodriguez, a man built like a mountain with arms covered in tattoos telling stories of a dozen deployments, raised his hand. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't about respect. It's about capability. In the field, we depend on each other for everything. One weak link gets everyone killed." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting Lieutenant Chen is a weak link, Rodriguez?" "I'm suggesting she's untested, sir. Training is one thing, combat is another." The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Sarah could feel every eye on her, measuring her, waiting for her response. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment that would define not just her career but potentially the future of women in special operations. She stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Petty Officer Rodriguez raises a valid concern. You don't know me and I don't know you. Trust isn't given, it's earned. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm not asking you to lower your standards. I'm asking for the chance to prove that I belong here." Sergeant Tom Wilson, a sniper with eyes like chips of ice, leaned back in his chair. "Pretty words," he said, his Texas drawl thick with skepticism. "But when the bullets start flying, pretty words don't stop them. When your teammate is bleeding out in some godforsaken desert, can you carry him to safety? When we're swimming through freezing water for miles, can you keep up?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "There's only one way to find out." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. These men had worked together for years, had saved each other's lives countless times. They were more than a team, they were brothers. And now they were being asked to accept an outsider, someone they saw as fundamentally different from themselves. Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan, the oldest man in the room at 38, had been quiet throughout the exchange. He was a legend among legends, a man who had more combat experience than the rest of them combined. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority earned through blood and sacrifice. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Sullivan said slowly. "I've seen men who looked like they could bench press a truck washout in their first week. I've seen men who looked like they belonged in a library carry wounded teammates for miles through enemy territory. Size doesn't matter. Gender doesn't matter. Heart matters. Determination matters. The willingness to die for the person next to you matters." He stood up, his weathered face serious. "But here's the thing. This team has a chemistry that's taken years to build. We know each other's moves before we make them. We can communicate with a look, coordinate with a gesture. Adding anyone new disrupts that chemistry, and that disruption can get people killed." Morrison nodded. "Which is why Lieutenant Chen will be training with you for the next month before any deployment. You'll have time to build that chemistry, to learn each other's capabilities." The briefing continued for another hour, covering logistics, training schedules, and protocols. But the real conversation was happening in the spaces between words, in the glances exchanged when Sarah wasn't looking, in the subtle body language that spoke of resistance and doubt. As the meeting ended and the men filed out, Sarah remained standing at attention, waiting for Morrison's dismissal. The commander studied her for a long moment, seeing something in her posture that reminded him of himself 20 years ago. The same determination, the same refusal to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. "Lieutenant," he said finally, "this won't be easy." Sarah's response was immediate and unwavering. "Nothing worth doing ever is, sir." The alarm shrieked at 0400 hours, cutting through the darkness like a razor. Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly, her body already moving before her mind fully processed the sound. This was her third week with Alpha Team, and the early morning drills had become as familiar as breathing. In the barracks, the other team members moved with the fluid efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Equipment was checked and double-checked, weapons cleaned and loaded, gear secured with the precision of a Swiss watch. Sarah fell into the rhythm, her movements matching theirs, but she could still feel the invisible wall between herself and the rest of the team. The training exercise that morning was a simulated hostage rescue in an abandoned warehouse complex. The scenario was designed to test everything: marksmanship, teamwork, communication, and decision-making under pressure. Sarah had studied the blueprints until she could navigate the building with her eyes closed, had practiced her entry techniques until they were flawless. As they geared up in the pre-dawn darkness, Petty Officer Rodriguez checked his weapon for the third time. "Remember," he said to no one in particular but loud enough for Sarah to hear, "real hostages don't get second chances. Real terrorists don't use blanks." Sarah adjusted her helmet and checked her radio. She had learned not to respond to these comments directly. Every reaction would be analyzed. Every response would be used as evidence for or against her. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the mission, on proving through actions rather than words. The team moved out in perfect formation, shadows sliding through the darkness. Sarah took her assigned position, maintaining proper spacing, her weapon ready but not threatening to her teammates. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows like dead eyes staring into the night. Chief Sullivan's voice crackled through their earpieces. "Remember, we've got 3 hostages inside, unknown number of tangos. Chen, you're covering the east entrance. Wilson and Rodriguez take the west. Morrison and I go through the main door. Martinez, you're overwatch." Sarah's heart pounded as she moved into position. This was her moment to prove herself, to show that all the training, all the preparation, all the pain had been worth it. She reached the east entrance and pressed herself against the wall, checking her watch. 30 seconds until go time. Through her earpiece, she could hear the controlled breathing of her teammates, the small sounds of final preparations. Then Sullivan's voice, calm and professional. "All units, stand by. Execute in 3, 2, 1, mark." The warehouse exploded into controlled chaos. Flashbang grenades lit up the interior like deadly fireworks. Sarah moved through her entrance, weapon raised, scanning for threats. The layout was exactly as the blueprints had shown, but in the smoke and confusion, every shadow could hide an enemy. Contact left. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. The sound of simulated gunfire filled the air. Sarah advanced down her assigned corridor, clearing each room methodically. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding her movements. Then she saw him, a figure in civilian clothes cowering behind an overturned table. One of the hostages. She moved closer, weapon trained on the surrounding area, scanning for threats. The man looked up at her with eyes wide with terror, and for a moment Sarah forgot this was an exercise. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here to get you out." But as she reached for the hostage, her peripheral vision caught movement. An instructor playing the role of a terrorist emerged from behind a stack of crates, his weapon aimed at the hostage. In that split second, Sarah had to make a choice that real SEALs faced in real combat situations every day. She could take the shot, potentially saving the hostage but risking hitting him if she missed. She could try to negotiate buying time but potentially allowing the terrorist to harm the hostage. Or she could attempt a tactical maneuver that might save everyone but required perfect execution. Sarah chose the third option. In one fluid motion, she dove forward, tackling the hostage and rolling both of them behind better cover while simultaneously firing at the terrorist. It was a move that required split-second timing, incredible physical coordination, and absolute confidence in her abilities. The exercise ended with the sharp blast of a whistle. Sarah lay on the warehouse floor, her body covering the hostage, her weapon still trained in the direction of the threat. Slowly, she became aware of silence where gunfire had been, of stillness where chaos had reigned. "Clear," came the call from the instructors. Sarah helped the role-playing hostage to his feet, checking him for any injuries from their sudden dive to the ground. The man, actually a Navy training specialist, looked at her with something approaching admiration. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that was some of the finest tactical thinking I've seen in 15 years of these exercises." As the team gathered for the post-exercise debrief, Sarah could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The instructors were analyzing her performance with the clinical detachment of surgeons, breaking down every decision, every movement, every choice. But for the first time, the criticism wasn't about her gender or her size. It was about tactics, technique, and effectiveness. Commander Morrison stood before a whiteboard covered in diagrams of the warehouse. "Chen's decision to shield the hostage while engaging the threat was textbook," he said, drawing arrows to show the angles of fire. She recognized that direct engagement would have put the civilian at risk and chose a more complex, but ultimately safer solution. Sergeant Wilson, who had been one of her harshest critics, nodded slowly. The dive and roll was clean, good body control, maintained weapon discipline throughout. But it was Chief Sullivan's assessment that carried the most weight. The grizzled veteran studied the tactical breakdown for a long moment before speaking. "In real combat, hesitation kills. Overthinking kills. Chen made her decision and executed it without second-guessing herself. That's what we need in the field." Yet even as the formal assessments were positive, Sarah could sense the continued reservations. After the debrief, as the team cleaned their weapons and secured their gear, the conversations happened in small groups, voices lowered, glances cast in her direction. Rodriguez and Wilson sat together, disassembling their rifles with practiced efficiency. "She did good today," Rodriguez admitted grudgingly. "But one exercise doesn't make a SEAL," Wilson nodded. "Plus, it was a simulation. No real bullets, no real consequences. When someone's actually shooting at you, when your decisions mean the difference between going home and going home in a box, that's when you find out what someone's really made of." Across the room, younger team members were having their own discussion. Martinez, barely 25 and new to the team himself, watched Sarah cleaning her weapon with mechanical precision. "She outperformed half of us today," he said to his companion, Petty Officer Adams. Adams shrugged. "One good day doesn't erase biology. When we're carrying full packs through 50 miles of desert, when we're swimming through rough seas for hours, when we need to haul a wounded teammate up a cliff face, that's when size and strength matter." Sarah heard fragments of these conversations, caught the meaningful looks and pregnant pauses when she approached different groups. She understood their concerns, even agreed with some of them. Physical capability was crucial in their line of work, and there were undeniable differences between men and women in terms of average strength and size. But she also knew something they didn't yet understand. That capability came in many forms. that what she might lack in raw physical power, she made up for in other ways. Her smaller size made her harder to hit, allowed her to move through spaces others couldn't. Her different perspective brought tactical insights that the team's traditional thinking might miss. As the day wore on, the team moved through additional training exercises, close quarters combat, weapons maintenance, communications protocols. Each activity was another test, another opportunity to prove herself or to fail. Sarah approached each one with the same methodical determination that had carried her through SEAL training. During the hand-to-hand combat session, she faced off against Rodriguez, who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds. The match was supposed to be instructional, a chance to practice techniques rather than a real fight. But Sarah could see in Rodriguez's eyes that this was about more than training. They circled each other on the mat, the rest of the team watching with unconcealed interest. Rodriguez made the first move, coming at her with the straightforward aggression that had served him well in countless real conflicts. But Sarah had spent years learning to turn size disadvantages into advantages, to use an opponent's strength against them. When Rodriguez lunged forward, Sarah stepped aside and used his momentum to send him tumbling past her. When he tried to grab her in a bear hug, she slipped free and applied a submission hold that left him gasping for air. It wasn't that she was stronger. She wasn't. But she was faster, more flexible, and more technically skilled. The match ended with Rodriguez tapping out, his face flushed with embarrassment and grudging respect. As he helped Sarah to her feet, he looked at her with new eyes. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown the team. "Same place you learned to shoot straight. Practice, practice, and more practice." That evening, as the team sat in the mess hall eating dinner, the conversations were different. There was still skepticism, still doubt, but there was also curiosity, questions about her background, her training, her motivations, small steps toward acceptance, toward the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she belonged among them. The mission briefing room felt different this time. The air was thick with tension, but it was the kind of tension that came before real action, not the kind that came from interpersonal conflict. Sarah sat in the front row with the rest of Alpha Team, her notebook open, pen ready. This wasn't another training exercise. This was the real thing. Commander Morrison stood before a large screen displaying satellite images of a compound in eastern Syria. The photos showed concrete walls, guard towers, and what appeared to be a heavily fortified complex in the middle of nowhere. "Gentlemen and lady," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of deadly seriousness, "we've got a time-sensitive rescue operation." The photos changed, showing grainy surveillance footage of a man in orange clothing being dragged across a courtyard. Dr. James Patterson, American civil engineer, was taken hostage 6 days ago while working on a water treatment facility. Intelligence indicates he's being held here, at this compound controlled by a particularly nasty group of terrorists. Sarah studied the images, her mind automatically cataloging defensive positions, entry points, escape routes. This was what all the training had been for. The chance to save an innocent life, to make a difference in a world that often seemed determined to tear itself apart. Wilson raised his hand. "Sir, what's the timeline?" Morrison's expression darkened. "Intelligence suggests they plan to execute Dr. Patterson in 72 hours. Video evidence indicates he's been tortured and is in poor physical condition. We need to move fast." The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from weather conditions to enemy strength estimates. The compound was isolated, surrounded by miles of desert with limited approaches. Intelligence suggested between 15 and 20 hostile fighters, armed with assault rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Chief Sullivan pointed to the satellite images. "The compound has 3 main buildings. Intelligence believes Patterson is being held in the central structure, likely on the ground floor for easier access. We'll need to approach from the east using this ridgeline for cover." Sarah absorbed every detail, every nuance of the plan. She would be responsible for securing the eastern approach while the rest of the team breached the main building. It was a critical position. If enemies tried to flank them or if they needed an emergency extraction route, she would be their lifeline. As the briefing ended, the team dispersed to prepare their equipment. This was when the ritual began. The careful, methodical process of checking and double-checking every piece of gear that might mean the difference between life and death. Weapons were cleaned and tested, ammunition counted, medical supplies inventoried. Sarah sat on her bunk, disassembling her rifle for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands moved with automatic precision, muscle memory guiding her fingers as her mind focused on the mission ahead. Around her, the other team members went through their own preparations, each man lost in his own thoughts about what lay ahead. Martinez sat nearby, adjusting the straps on his pack. He was the youngest member of the team, barely old enough to drink legally, but he had already proven himself in 2 previous deployments. "You nervous?" he asked Sarah quietly. Sarah looked up from her weapon. "Terrified," she admitted. "But that's normal, right? If you're not scared, you're not paying attention." Martinez smiled. "That's exactly what Chief told me before my first real mission. Said the fear keeps you alive, makes you careful." Across the room, Rodriguez was having a different conversation with Wilson. "Think she's ready for this?" Rodriguez asked, his voice low but not quite low enough. Wilson considered the question seriously. "Training says yes. Instincts say maybe. Guess we'll find out." The truth was, they were all nervous about having an untested member on such a critical mission, not because Sarah was a woman, but because she was new. In their world, trust wasn't just important. It was literally a matter of life and death. They needed to know that the person watching their back would be there when the bullets started flying, would make the right decisions under pressure, would put the mission and the team above everything else. That evening, as the team gathered for a final equipment check, Chief Sullivan called Sarah aside. They walked to a quiet corner of the base, away from the others, where they could speak privately. "Chen," Sullivan began, his weathered face serious, "tomorrow's going to be different from anything you've experienced. Training is one thing, but real combat, that's something else entirely. The sounds are different, the smells are different, everything moves faster and slower at the same time." Sarah nodded. "I understand, Chief." Sullivan studied her for a moment. "Do you? Because once we're on that helicopter, once we're committed to this mission, there's no going back. No second chances, no do-overs. Every decision you make affects not just you, but every man on this team." The weight of his words settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy pack. She had known intellectually that real missions carried real consequences, but hearing it stated so bluntly brought the reality into sharp focus. "I know you think you're ready," Sullivan continued, "and maybe you are, but I need you to understand something. If you freeze up, if you hesitate at the wrong moment, if you make the wrong call, people die. Not training dummies, not role players. Real people with families and dreams and futures." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Chief, I've spent every day for the past 3 years preparing for this moment. I've pushed my body beyond what I thought was possible, trained my mind to stay calm under pressure, learned to make split-second decisions that could save lives. I can't promise I won't make mistakes because everyone makes mistakes. But I can promise that I'll give everything I have to bring Dr. Patterson home and keep this team safe." Sullivan nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do." The next morning came too soon and not soon enough. The team gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their gear loaded, their minds focused. The helicopter that would take them to the insertion point sat on the tarmac like a mechanical beast, its rotors already spinning. Commander Morrison conducted a final briefing, reviewing the plan one last time. "Remember, this is a rescue mission, not a combat operation. We get in, we get Patterson, we get out. Minimal casualties, maximum speed. Questions?" There were no questions. There never were at this stage. Everything that could be said had been said. Everything that could be planned had been planned. Now it was time to trust in their training, their equipment, and each other. As they boarded the helicopter, Sarah felt the familiar mix of fear and excitement that preceded every major challenge in her life. This was what she had worked for, what she had sacrificed for, what she had dreamed of since she was a child, watching war movies and wondering if she could ever be brave enough to serve her country. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Sarah looked around at her teammates, these men who had become as familiar as family over the past month. Rodriguez was checking his weapon for the 10th time, his face a mask of concentration. Wilson stared out the window at the landscape rushing by below, his sniper's eyes automatically cataloging landmarks and potential threats. Martinez looked younger than ever, but his hands were steady on his rifle. Chief Sullivan caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed confidence, encouragement, and warning all at once. This was it. The moment when all the training would be put to the ultimate test, when theory would meet reality. When Sarah would discover once and for all if she truly belonged among America's elite warriors. The helicopter flew through the night, carrying them toward a destiny none of them could predict. In a few hours, they would face life and death decisions. Split-second choices that would determine not only their own fates, but the fate of Dr. Patterson, an innocent man whose only crime had been trying to help people in a war-torn country. Sarah closed her eyes and ran through the mission plan one more time, visualizing every step, every contingency, every possible outcome. She thought about Dr. Patterson, somewhere in that compound, probably wondering if anyone was coming for him, if he would ever see his family again. She thought about her teammates, trusting her to do her job, to watch their backs, to be the warrior they needed her to be. The helicopter flew on through the darkness, carrying them toward their date with destiny, toward the moment when Sarah Chen would discover what she was truly made of, and when the rest of Alpha Team would learn whether their newest member was worthy of the brotherhood they had sworn to protect. The desert air was cold against Sarah's face as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone. Through her night vision goggles, the Syrian landscape looked like an alien world painted in shades of green and black. Rocky outcroppings cast strange shadows, and in the distance, she could see the faint outline of their target, the compound where Dr. Patterson was being held. 2 minutes to insertion. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, her breathing become more controlled. This was it, the moment when months of training would be put to the ultimate test. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and sand. Alpha Team moved out in perfect formation, their movements silent and coordinated despite the chaos of rotor wash and desert wind. Sarah took her position in the line, her weapon ready, her mind focused on the mission ahead. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the night, the team was left alone in the vast expanse of desert. The silence was almost overwhelming after the constant noise of the flight. Chief Sullivan checked his GPS and pointed toward a ridgeline about 2 miles away. That was where they would establish their observation post before making the final approach to the compound. The march across the desert was a lesson in endurance and stealth. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid loose rocks that might create noise. Every breath had to be controlled to minimize their thermal signature. Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm that had been drilled into her during training. Move. Pause, observe, move again. After an hour of careful movement, they reached the ridgeline overlooking the compound. Through their scopes, they could see the layout exactly as the satellite images had shown. 3 buildings arranged in a triangle, with guard towers at each corner. Lights illuminated the central courtyard, where 2 guards walked lazy patrols. Sullivan studied the compound through high-powered binoculars. Looks like intel was right about the guard strength. I count 6 tangos visible, probably twice that many inside. He lowered the binoculars and looked at his team. Remember, this isn't about taking territory or eliminating threats. This is about getting one man out alive. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rodriguez and Wilson would approach from the west, creating a distraction to draw the guards away from the main building. Morrison and Sullivan would breach the central structure where Patterson was believed to be held. Martinez would provide overwatch from the ridgeline, and Sarah would secure the eastern approach to prevent enemy reinforcements or provide an emergency extraction route. As they prepared to move out, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Rodriguez, the man who had been most vocal about his doubts regarding her capabilities. "Chen," he said quietly, "you've got our backs out there. We're counting on you." The words carried more weight than any medal or commendation could have. This was acceptance, the acknowledgement that she was truly part of the team. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The final approach began at 200 hours. Sarah split off from the main group, moving carefully down the eastern slope of the ridge. Her job was to reach a position about 300 meters from the compound's eastern wall, where she could observe the approach and provide cover if needed. As she settled into her position behind a cluster of rocks, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Through her scope, she could see Rodriguez and Wilson moving into position on the opposite side of the compound. Morrison and Sullivan were ghost-like shadows advancing on the main building. The first indication that something was wrong came through her earpiece. Martinez's voice tight with tension. "Chief, I've got movement in the north building. Looks like more guards than we anticipated. Sullivan's response was immediate and calm. Copy that. Maintain overwatch. Rodriguez, Wilson, hold your position until we confirm the package location. But even as the words were spoken, Sarah could see through her scope that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Guards were emerging from buildings, weapons in hand. Someone had detected the team's presence, though she couldn't tell how. Contact. Rodriguez's voice exploded through the radio as muzzle flashes lit up the western side of the compound. The carefully planned stealth operation had just become a running firefight. Sarah watched through her scope as tracer rounds cut through the darkness. The guards were responding faster and more effectively than intelligence had predicted. This wasn't a group of disorganized terrorists. These were trained fighters who knew their business. Chen, we need suppressing fire on the east wall, Sullivan's voice commanded through her earpiece. Multiple tangos moving to flank Rodriguez and Wilson. Sarah shifted her aim, acquiring targets among the guards rushing toward her teammates' position. Her training took over, muscle memory guiding her movements. Breathe in, breathe out, squeeze the trigger. One guard dropped. Shift aim, acquire new target, fire again. But even as she provided cover fire, Sarah could see that the mission was going sideways fast. There were more enemies than anticipated. They were better organized than expected, and worst of all, there was no sign of Dr. Patterson in the main building. Package not in primary location, Morrison's voice reported tersely. Searching secondary locations. Time was running out. The longer they stayed engaged, the more likely it became that enemy reinforcements would arrive, or that their extraction helicopter would be forced to abort. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions now, indicating that the team was facing at least twice as many enemies as intelligence had suggested. Through her scope, she watched Wilson and Rodriguez moving from cover to cover, their positions being steadily compromised by superior numbers. Martinez was doing his best to provide overwatch, but he was one man trying to cover multiple firing positions. Then Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of 4 fighters was moving around the compound's perimeter, clearly intending to flank Wilson and Rodriguez from their blind spot. If those men reached their intended position, they would have clear shots at both SEALs. Chief, I've got 4 tangos moving to flank Wilson and Rodriguez from the northeast. They'll have clear shots in about 30 seconds. Sullivan's response came immediately. Take them out. But Sarah could see the problem. The flanking group was moving through an area with limited visibility from her position. She would have to relocate to get clean shots, which meant leaving her assigned position and potentially compromising the team's eastern approach. It was the kind of split-second decision that defined special operations: follow orders exactly as given, or adapt to changing circumstances and take initiative. Sarah made her choice. Moving to new position to engage flankers, she reported, already gathering her equipment. Negative. Maintain your position, came Sullivan's immediate response. But Sarah was already moving, low crawling through the rocks and sand to reach a position where she could engage the flanking group. She could hear Sullivan's voice in her earpiece, but she ignored it, focused entirely on reaching her new firing position before Wilson and Rodriguez were compromised. The flanking group was moving faster than she had anticipated. Sarah reached her new position just as the lead fighter was raising his weapon to fire at Wilson's position. There was no time for careful aim, no time for perfect breathing control. She fired 3 quick shots, dropping 2 of the flankers immediately. The remaining 2 fighters turned toward her position, their weapons swinging in her direction. Sarah rolled sideways as bullets struck the rocks where she had been lying, sending fragments of stone flying through the air. She came up firing, her shots guided more by instinct than sight in the chaos of combat. One of the remaining flankers dropped, but the 4th man found cover behind a concrete barrier. Sarah could see him moving, trying to get an angle on Wilson's position. She made another split-second decision, leaving her cover and sprinting across 30 meters of open ground to reach a position where she could engage him. Bullets whined through the air around her as she ran, but her focus was entirely on reaching the new position. She dove behind a low wall just as the flanker emerged from his cover, weapon aimed at Wilson. Sarah's shot took him center mass, ending the threat. Flankers down, she reported, breathing hard. But even as she spoke, she realized that her movement had been observed. Guards were now converging on her position from multiple directions. She had successfully protected Wilson and Rodriguez. But in doing so, she had exposed herself to a coordinated attack. Chen, you've got multiple tangos moving on your position. Martinez's voice warned through the radio. "You need to move now." Sarah looked around desperately, but there was limited cover in her immediate area. The nearest good position was 50 meters away across open ground. Between her and safety were at least 6 armed fighters who now knew exactly where she was. It was then that she heard Sullivan's voice through the radio, not giving orders to the team, but speaking directly to her. "Chen, we're coming for you. Hold your position and stay alive." The words carried a weight of meaning that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. They meant that she was no longer an outsider, no longer the untested new member. She was part of the team. And teams. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall as bullets chipped away at the stone above her head. The sound of incoming fire was deafening, a constant crack and whine that made communication nearly impossible. Through her earpiece, she could hear the controlled chaos of her teammates coordinating their response to her desperate situation. "Martinez, give me covering fire on the north side," Sullivan's voice commanded. "Rodriguez, Wilson bound toward Chen's position. Morrison, status on the package?" "Still searching," came Morrison's terse reply. "Building 2 is clear, moving to Building 3. Sarah counted at least 8 muzzle flashes from different positions around her. The enemy fighters had her pinned down effectively, and they were coordinating their fire to keep her trapped while others moved to flank her position. She had maybe 2 minutes before they would have clear shots from multiple angles. Her mind raced through her options. The training scenarios had covered situations like this, but the reality was far more intense than any simulation. Every decision carried life or death consequences, not just for herself but for her entire team. Through a gap in the wall, she could see Rodriguez and Wilson advancing toward her position, using fire and movement tactics to cross the open ground, but they were taking heavy fire and their progress was slow. Martinez was doing his best to suppress the enemy positions from his overwatch point, but he was one rifle against multiple targets. Sarah made a tactical assessment. If she stayed pinned down, the enemy would eventually maneuver into positions where they could eliminate her. If she tried to run, she would be cut down in the open. But there was a third option, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation but might give her teammates the opportunity they needed. She keyed her radio. "Chief, I'm going to create a distraction. When I move, Rodriguez and Wilson need to bound to that low wall at my 2 o'clock. "Negative, Chen. Stay put. We're coming to you." But Sarah could see what Sullivan couldn't from his position. The enemy was setting up a crossfire that would trap Rodriguez and Wilson in the open. Someone had to break up their coordination, and she was the only one in position to do it. "Chief, there are 8 tangos with overlapping fields of fire. If Rodriguez and Wilson try to advance under current conditions, they'll be caught in a kill zone. I can disrupt their positioning, but you have to trust me." There was a pause that lasted an eternity. Sarah could hear gunfire, could hear Martinez calling out target positions, could hear the controlled breathing of her teammates as they moved through the deadly landscape of combat. Finally, Sullivan's voice came through her earpiece. "What do you need?" 30 seconds of suppressing fire from Martinez. "When I give the word, Rodriguez and Wilson bound to the wall. I'll draw their attention and break up their fire coordination." It was a dangerous plan, one that relied on split-second timing and absolute trust between team members. Sarah would have to expose herself to draw enemy fire away from her advancing teammates, counting on their speed and Martinez's covering fire to keep her alive long enough to make a difference. "Martinez, can you give Chen 30 seconds of effective suppression?" Sullivan asked. "Roger that, Chief. I've got good angles on 6 of the 8 positions." Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Chen, this is crazy. We'll find another way." Sarah checked her ammunition and adjusted her position slightly. "Rodriguez, trust me. I know what I'm doing." There was another pause, then Sullivan's voice, carrying the weight of command and the burden of sending someone into extreme danger. "Chen, on your signal." Sarah took 3 deep breaths, visualizing the movement she was about to make. She would need to cross 15 meters of open ground to reach a position where she could effectively engage multiple enemy positions. It was the kind of move that looked impossible on paper but might just work because of its very audacity. "Martinez, commence suppressing fire in 3, 2, 1. Mark." The sniper's rifle began its deadly rhythm, each shot precisely placed to force enemy fighters to take cover. Sarah burst from behind her wall, sprinting across the open ground while firing at every muzzle flash she could see. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Enemy fighters who had been concentrating their fire on Rodriguez and Wilson's approach suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Their careful coordination dissolved into individual reactions as they scrambled to engage this new threat. Rodriguez, Wilson, move now, Sarah shouted into her radio as she dove behind a concrete culvert. She could see her teammates bounding forward, covering the critical distance while the enemy was distracted. But her position was even more exposed than before, and the enemy fighters were quickly realizing that she was now the primary threat that needed to be eliminated. Bullets sparked off the concrete around her as she tried to make herself as small as possible. Through the chaos, she could hear Sullivan's voice coordinating the team's movements, hear Martinez calling out targets, hear the steady advance of her teammates as they fought their way toward her position. Then Morrison's voice cut through everything else. Package located. Building 3, basement level. He's alive but in bad shape. Relief flooded through Sarah, but it was immediately replaced by renewed urgency. Finding Dr. Patterson was only half the mission. They still had to get him out alive, and their current tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Chen, can you hold for 2 more minutes? Sullivan asked. Sarah assessed her situation. She had limited ammunition remaining. She was pinned down by superior numbers, and the enemy was beginning to coordinate their fire again. But Rodriguez and Wilson were now in position to provide effective supporting fire, and Martinez continued his deadly accurate overwatch. I can hold, she replied, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. The next 2 minutes felt like hours. Sarah fought with the controlled desperation of someone who understood that failure meant not just her own death, but the death of her teammates and the loss of an innocent hostage. She moved from position to position within her limited area of cover, engaging targets when she could, suppressing enemy fire when necessary. Through it all, she could hear Morrison's progress reports as he worked to extract Dr. Patterson from the basement. The engineer was conscious but weak, suffering from dehydration and the effects of torture. He would need assistance to move, which would slow their extraction considerably. Package is mobile, but barely, Morrison reported. He can walk with assistance, but not quickly. Sullivan made the kind of command decision that defined leadership under pressure. Rodriguez, Wilson, establish a base of fire and hold this position. Martinez, continue overwatch. Morrison, get the package to the extraction point. Chen, you're with me. We're going to clear a path for Morrison. It was then that Sarah heard the words that would define not just this mission, but her entire career as a Navy SEAL. As she prepared to move from her position to link up with Sullivan, Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. Chen's been laying down effective fire for 10 minutes straight. She's taken out at least 6 tangos and disrupted their entire defensive coordination. Whatever doubts any of us had about her capabilities, she's more than proven herself tonight. Wilson's voice followed immediately. Agreed. She made tactical decisions that saved our lives. The flanking maneuver she spotted and stopped would have gotten Rodriguez and me killed. But it was Chief Sullivan's response that carried the most weight. The grizzled veteran who had seen more combat than anyone else on the team, who had questioned whether she belonged among them, spoke with the authority of absolute conviction. Chen showed more tactical awareness and raw courage in the last 15 minutes than most operators show in entire deployments. She's earned her place on this team. As Sarah moved from her position to link up with Sullivan, dodging enemy fire and returning shots when she could, she felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute trust and acceptance of her teammates, not because she was a woman who had proven she could keep up with men, but because she was a warrior who had proven she belonged among warriors. The extraction fight was far from over. They still had to get Dr. Patterson to safety, still had to make it to the helicopter pickup point, still had to survive the next critical minutes of combat. But something fundamental had changed in those moments of desperate fighting. Sarah Chen was no longer the new member trying to prove herself. She was part of Alpha Team, a full member of one of the military's most elite units. The words of acceptance from her teammates meant more than any medal or commendation ever could, because they came from men who understood what it meant to trust someone with your life. The extraction point was 2 miles of hostile desert away from the compound. Sarah moved alongside Chief Sullivan, both of them providing security for Morrison, who was half carrying Dr. Patterson through the rocky terrain. The engineer was conscious, but weak, his face bearing the marks of his captivity, his movements slow and unsteady. Behind them, Rodriguez and Wilson provided rear security, engaging the pursuing enemy fighters who had quickly organized a pursuit. Martinez had displaced from his overwatch position and was now moving parallel to the main group, his sniper rifle ready to engage threats from distance. Dr. Patterson stumbled, nearly falling before Morrison caught him. The man was clearly at the limits of his endurance, his body weakened by days of imprisonment and abuse. Sarah could see the concern in Morrison's face. They were moving too slowly, and the enemy pursuit was gaining ground. "Chief," Sarah said quietly, "at this pace, they're going to catch us before we reach the extraction point." Sullivan nodded grimly. He had reached the same conclusion. Through their night vision equipment, they could see muzzle flashes in the distance behind them, indicating that their pursuers were closing the gap. The helicopter pickup was still 30 minutes away, and they needed at least 20 minutes to reach the landing zone. "Options?" Sullivan asked, though they both knew what the tactical situation demanded. Sarah looked back at the pursuing fighters, then at Dr. Patterson's condition, then at the terrain ahead. The mathematics of the situation were clear. Someone would have to slow down the pursuit to give the others time to reach safety. "I can establish a blocking position at that ridge line," Sarah said, pointing to a natural choke point about half a mile back. "Steep approaches on both sides, good cover, clear fields of fire. I can hold them there long enough for you to get the package to the extraction point." Sullivan studied the terrain through his binoculars. It was indeed a good position for a delaying action, but it was also a position from which there might be no escape. A single operator, no matter how skilled, could only hold off superior numbers for so long. "Negative," Sullivan replied. "We'll find another way." But even as he spoke, they could see that there was no other way. The enemy was moving faster than anticipated, using vehicles to close the distance across the open desert. Soon they would be within effective rifle range, and Dr. Patterson's condition made it impossible for the team to move quickly enough to stay ahead of them. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio from 20 meters ahead. "Chief, the package is deteriorating. He can't maintain this pace much longer." Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her career, the choice that separated true warriors from those who merely wore the uniform. "Chief, give me 5 minutes to reach that position. When you hear me open fire, move as fast as you can toward the extraction point. Don't look back, don't try to come back for me. Get Dr. Patterson home." Sullivan grabbed her arm. "Chen, that's not how we operate. We don't leave people behind." Sarah met his eyes, and in that moment, he saw something that reminded him of himself 20 years earlier. The absolute determination to do whatever was necessary to complete the mission and protect her teammates. "Chief, you taught me that the mission comes first. Dr. Patterson has a family, has a life to get back to. My job is to make sure that happens." Before Sullivan could respond, Sarah was moving, bounding across the desert terrain toward the ridgeline that would become her final stand. She could hear Sullivan's voice calling her back, could hear the concern and anger in his tone, but she didn't slow down. The ridge position was everything she had hoped for tactically. Good cover from behind large boulders, clear sight lines in multiple directions, and most importantly, it was the only practical route for vehicles pursuing her teammates. If the enemy wanted to continue their pursuit, they would have to go through her. Sarah set up her position methodically, checking her ammunition, adjusting her equipment, preparing for what she knew would be the fight of her life. She had 4 magazines remaining, plus her sidearm. Against an unknown number of enemy fighters, with vehicle support it wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Through her scope, she could see the pursuit force approaching. At least 12 fighters in 3 vehicles moving fast across the desert floor. They would reach her position in less than 5 minutes, which meant she needed to start engaging them soon to slow their advance. Her radio crackled. "Chen, this is Sullivan. I'm ordering you to fall back to our position immediately." Sarah smiled as she took aim at the lead vehicle. "Chief, with all due respect, I can't hear you very clearly. Must be radio interference." She fired, her shot taking out the driver of the lead vehicle. The truck swerved wildly before rolling over, throwing fighters into the sand. The other vehicles immediately spread out and began returning fire, but they were now moving more cautiously, no longer confident in their ability to simply drive through the opposition. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah fought the kind of engagement that military historians would later study and analyze. She moved constantly within her position, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to fix her location. She picked her shots carefully, making every bullet count, targeting vehicle engines and exposed fighters with equal precision. The enemy tried everything to dislodge her. They attempted to flank her position, but the terrain channeled them into areas where she had clear shots. They tried to suppress her with concentrated fire, but she used the natural cover to stay protected while returning accurate fire. They even attempted to call in mortar support, but their communication equipment had been damaged in the initial contact. Through it all, Sarah could hear the voices of her teammates on the radio, coordinating their movement toward the extraction point. Morrison's reports on Dr. Patterson's condition, Martinez's updates on their progress, Rodriguez and Wilson's confirmation that the pursuit had been stopped. And underlying it all, Sullivan's voice, sometimes giving tactical updates, sometimes simply saying her name, as if trying to maintain some connection across the distance that separated them. "Chen, extraction bird is inbound. We're at the landing zone." Sarah fired at another fighter who was trying to work his way around her left flank. "Copy that, Chief. Get the package on that bird and get him home. We're not leaving without you." Sarah ducked as a burst of automatic fire chipped rock fragments from the boulder she was using for cover. She was down to her last magazine, and the enemy was finally beginning to coordinate their movements effectively. Soon they would have enough people in position to overwhelm her defenses. "Chief, you have to go. The mission is complete. Dr. Patterson is safe. That's what matters." But even as she spoke, Sarah could hear something that changed everything: the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. Not just one helicopter, but multiple aircraft, and they were coming in fast and low. Sullivan's voice came through the radio, and for the first time since the mission began, there was something approaching relief in his tone. "Chen, we called in close air support. Extraction bird has a full escort, and they're armed for bear." The attack helicopters arrived like avenging angels, their weapon systems lighting up the desert floor around Sarah's position. The enemy fighters who had been pressing their attack suddenly found themselves under assault from above. Their vehicles destroyed, their positions untenable. In less than 3 minutes, the entire tactical situation had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted, and the surviving enemy fighters were retreating as fast as they could move. Sarah's extraction came courtesy of a rope dropped from one of the escort helicopters. As she clipped in and was lifted from her position, she could see the devastation below. The vehicles she had destroyed, the positions she had held, the ground where she had made her stand. But more importantly, she could see her teammates gathered around the medical helicopter where Dr. Patterson was receiving treatment. They were safe, the mission was complete, and somehow, against all odds, everyone was going home alive. Later, as they flew back toward base, Chief Sullivan sat down next to Sarah in the helicopter. The noise made conversation nearly impossible, but he leaned close to her ear and spoke words that would stay with her for the rest of her career. "Chen, what you did back there, that's what being a SEAL is all about. Not the training, not the equipment, not the tactics. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything for your teammates and your mission. You've earned your place among us." 6 months later, when Alpha Team was briefing new candidates about what it meant to be a Navy SEAL, they would tell the story of the mission in Syria. They would talk about tactical coordination, about improvisation under pressure, about the importance of trust between teammates. But the story they told most often was about the words that had silenced an entire SEAL team and changed everything. Not "let her finish," but the words that came after. The acknowledgement from hardened warriors that courage, determination, and tactical excellence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. Sarah Chen had started as an outsider trying to prove she belonged. She ended as a warrior who had proven that excellence recognizes no boundaries, that heroism comes in many forms, and that the Brotherhood of Arms is open to anyone willing to pay the price of admission. The compound in Syria was eventually destroyed by airstrike. Dr. Patterson recovered fully and returned to his work helping people in conflict zones around the world. and Alpha Team continued their missions, now with complete confidence in every member of their unit. Because sometimes the most important words aren't the ones that silence a room. They're the ones that open minds, change hearts, and prove that true warriors are defined not by who they are, but by what they do when everything is on the line.